You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Hello, Cyclothids, and welcome to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. I am your host, Robert Walker, and joining me today are my friends and gaming companions, Keegan and Kimothy. Welcome to the show, you two.
Hello.
Hey.
So today we're going to be talking about character backstories. It's an integral part of character creation. In my opinion, it's one of the most important parts about having an effective character who stays tied to the plot and helps drive the story along. What are your guys' thoughts on character backstories? I know some people aren't even interested in them at all, and some groups don't require them. I think for all my games, I require a character backstory. What do you guys think about it?
I need at least something, whether, especially as a GM, I need at least something to be able to say, okay, great. You find this interesting. I'm going to play with it and I'm going to lead you along with it.
Yeah, I'd definitely say a character, like a backstory, is required for you to be more like integral to the world, especially since most of these worlds are like pre-built from what I've seen. So it's like makes it a lot more easy to get into the game when you're already like part of the world.
Even further, though, if you're doing something where you're kind of building it together as GM and player, or even on a homebrew, you want to be included in the world in that space. Otherwise, why are you adventuring?
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different ways about going about putting together a character backstory. I think one of the most interesting ways that I've read about, and it's something I've started to do a lot with my villains when I'm creating a villain, but it also makes sense to do with a character, which is as you're creating the character to conduct a character interview. This is meaning you're going to ask questions and answer them as though you were your character. So you can ask things about, how old are you? Why did you start adventuring? What happened on your very first adventure? What kind of town are you from? So just throwing out a bunch of almost like first date kind of questions to get to know a character, and then recording your answers so that you have a response as to here's the components of the backstory that then I can go ahead and write that backstory out. Do either of you have anything that you've used in the past for writing a backstory or coming up with ideas for?
My favorite thing to do is actually to roll it randomly. So there's the old, what is it? We've used it before. The Hero's Handbook.
Yes.
From
third edition.
Yeah. Yes. Also, Paizo's first edition Pathfinder DMG has the same thing where you actually roll randomly your entire backstory, and you have your like best friend, you have your mentor, you have a childhood event, you have the thing that made you start adventuring, and you can even go as far as randomly rolling what your relationship is with someone else in the party too. So I enjoy that aspect in terms of how to create a backstory, because then it's also, it's surprising how often the dice will make certain things happen.
Yeah, I've said it before in podcasts before that the dice know the story.
Oh, yes.
And I think that's a perfect example of this, because there are so many times when we've used those guidebooks and those rolling guides to create character backstories. And by the time we get to the end of it, we're always like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's so cool. That's such a great,
makes perfect
and it fits.
Sense.
And then as other people do it in the group, they are able to tie their backstory into what other people rolled. And you kind of weave this network of character backstories together. And it works pretty well. What about you, Keegan? What have you done in the past for character backstories?
Well, I've only made a few backstories just because I've only played a few times. But generally what I stick with is just like whatever like the leading event is in the world is, I'm just going to base my character around that, like how it affected my character in its daily life, and then just kind of work from there. If I'm going into the game like I did this previous one where I'm just kind of like at level 7 all the way into I've already well-depth story, I kind of just like make it really ambiguous what I am. Like my guy was just, an orphan boy who ended up being amnesiac, which, just something that like kind of inserts me and it makes it seem natural enough. But yeah, I generally just would pick something from the world that's like a leading factor that's going on. Like Tolis right now is like at war. So it's like, how does the war affect me and what family would I be a part of?
Right.
Along with like the Pale Tower, how my relation to that would be, which I would not be related at all. So
you bring up a very good and important point, though, for people to remember as they're creating backstories is at some point your backstory should be tied to the world in which you're playing.
Oh, yeah.
If you just have this backstory that's written, and you're like existing on an island that doesn't have any connection to the world that you're in, it doesn't give you a lot of springboard for motivation to go on quests, to adventure in that world. You need something that ties you to the world. Characters and NPCs are a very good thing to be tied to, as well as events that have happened in the past or are happening currently, so that your character is invested in the world that you're playing in.
100%. And frankly, like if you're going to come with a backstory, come with what you're comfortable with to the table. Whether you have 4 pages, 4 paragraphs, or 40 pages, I can work with anything as a GM, but also don't write everything for me at the same time. Leave some holes for someone else to pick into, because like we discussed before, you might have a PC that's like, oh, hey, I can fill that spot for you. I can be your mentor. And now all of a sudden you have a relationship as opposed to just this random person.
One of the things I think is really important as well in a character backstory is that you need to have places where your backstory is tied to other characters' backstory.
Yes.
Because you want parties to work so much more cohesively when the players already start with some sort of formal connection or background that they've shared. A shared experience goes a lot further in keeping a party together.
Well, I think the biggest thing, though, for a backstory, you have to start with like their alignment.
Yes.
Because that's like, if you pick that first, making the backstory just becomes a whole lot easier, because you're basically either built to this alignment or you've always been this alignment kind of idea.
Well,
I like that.
Yeah, and I think in like evil alignments is a very good example, because if you start with an evil alignment as a character, then you generally are going to have an interesting story about how you got there.
Oh, yes.
Just because I think most people are typically good at heart, but there's something that turns them, down a different path at some point earlier on in their life, or at a various point in their life, that changes the way that they interact with the world to see it more cynically.
And frankly, like, especially in that case, if you're going if you're going to play, I'm a evil PC. Okay, great. Communication's key. Make sure you're communicating with your table and your GM, but also let the GM write that too, because that person, that catalyst that turned or helped you turn evil in that case, they might actually play a bigger role in the overall narrative. Give them a name, give them how they met or something like that, but then let the GM have fun with that too, because then you're going to have a moment later on in the game where you get a mysterious letter and you recognize that handwriting, and oh goodness, what's going to happen then?
You're right. DM involvement in backstories is a pretty important thing too, because it gives them the opportunity to then tie your backstory to their world and the things that they're creating. And the more overlap that exists between the characters and the world, I think the more successful a campaign is ultimately going to be.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
So let me bring up one other idea. It's a concept that I talked about in my book a little bit, and I do want to mention it here because I don't think we've talked about it on the podcast before. But in terms of character backstories, one thing that always, I guess, kind of bothers me a little bit is when, you're starting a first level campaign and you've asked your characters to come create backstories, and then they come to you with this backstory that's like epic level story, which just does not make sense. First level characters are quite literally, by definition, characters who lack experience. So they need to have a backstory that has not garnered them the amount of experience that would make them actually starting as like a 7th or 8th or 9th or even higher level character. But it still needs to be interesting enough to be a springboard.
So I'll contradict this a little bit, because frankly, I'm of the camp of Lord of the Rings fans that believe that Gandalf, when he fought the Balrog, was probably only anywhere from 5th to 7th level. But how old was he at that point? hundreds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Over 500 years old.
Over 500 years old. So at the same time, I see your point, but I don't think that you necessarily need to have. You can still do epic things even at low level, because when you consider, like, if you actually look at, not everybody in the town guard is a 5th level fighter.
Sure. But I think more the point that I'm making here is, if you're a 1st level character and your backstory says that you slaughtered a tribe of kobolds, you'd already be 2nd level.
Okay, yes.
So
right.
It needs to match the level at which you're starting. So I think your experiences need to be things that wouldn't have garnered you enough combat experience to level you up, or enough roleplay experience to level you up. They need to be things that are important, like tragic moments,
Sure.
powerful events, things that are very powerful, very moving, but don't give you quote unquote game XP.
I think you
Right.
can still play with that a little bit.
I definitely have room for leeway in it. I'm not going to throw somebody's backstory out if they come to me and they're like, well, I used to be the leader of this town and I was, a prince or whatever,
Okay, no.
and all this stuff. And it's like, well, at 1st level, you had how many years of Royal Academy training probably before you became, so that kind of stuff always is like, settle down. Maybe when we start a 5th level campaign, that backstory will work. But if we're starting a 1st level, give me something like, what happened on your family's farm? What happened when you were taking goods to market and your family was ambushed? Little things like that, where you've had some stuff happen that makes sense. It ties you to the world. It gives you a place to start your adventures. But I don't think the backstory should be, look at all these adventures that I've already had over the last 25 years. And, I'm for some reason still 1st level.
Yeah, no, like I think with that, if you're trying to be like, I had legendary moments, like I was almost accepted into like the academy or like the battle school or whatever, but something prevented me from doing that. And now I'm in this group trying to regain my footing kind of deal. That would make more sense than being like, I was in the academy for 3 years and I gained all these abilities from fighting and now I'm back to basic for some reason.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Unless like I got cursed or something. That would make sense.
I think you can still have a 1st level, let's say, prince or princess or something like that, and have them be like a rogue. And the way that they got their talents is through picking the locks to get out in the middle of the night from the castle.
I mean, you could do it. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying write it so that it makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of those things like, yeah, if you're like a 25-year-old prince, you haven't just picked up the skills that you would as a 1st level rogue. You also would have had, 15 ranks in knowledge, nobility, royalty, etiquette, like all these types of things that are taught to those in nobility day in and day out, because their entire job is learning how to run a kingdom.
Fair.
Yeah, I guess if you're going to do that, you would have to like incorporate like something that debuffed you, like I
didn't
gained
pay
amnesia
attention
or something. Yeah, I just straight up ignored all my teachings. Something that like puts you back down to level 1. That I could see happening.
You do bring up an interesting point, because I do think there was at one point Dustin, another member who plays with us in our group, had a character backstory that they had gotten all the way up to like 20th level in some organization, and then they had either betrayed the organization or the organization had betrayed them, and so as a penance or something, they stripped him of all his power through some sort of magical ritual. So I think in rare circumstances like that, you can go ahead and incorporate something like that. But even in that, you have to take in, as a GM, you have to take in, well, they still had, 20 levels worth of experience at one point, and they didn't lose all that knowledge. So how do you mitigate what they know because of their backstory with what they know because of their character sheet?
Interesting.
And I think that's kind of a hard question to answer.
Well, that would just make it kind of like make it feel like that's their personal quest through this campaign. It's like, I need to gain my knowledge back.
Yeah, and I think that kind of was it. It was like they were trying to regain their status or regain their place of power. But they wanted to, I believe he wanted to keep all of the memories and everything that he had from before.
That's harder.
So it made it a little tricky. It was a very unique situation. But I think little things like that are possible. You can have unique stuff, and there's always exceptions to every rule.
It's just more on the DM's end, whether or not they'll let that go. Which, I mean, the story should be like what the DM wants, really, because they're making the whole campaign. So it's like, don't make a story that's going to be super unreasonable is also a thing. Consider what they've already built.
It's a labor of love.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work, I've seen, to be a DM.
It does. Another thing probably to talk about that's, I think, important part of Backstories is figuring out a voice and mannerisms for your character. That always doesn't appear on the pages of the words that you write for a character backstory. But I think it is important to have an idea when you come to the table of how you want them to sound. Sometimes this could be done in a session 0 or an early on, like a character creation campaign, if you have a few minutes for role play, because it does seem like sometimes a lot of the first session is just trying to figure out how a character is going to behave. But if you can have that already figured out, I think it does save time. And I think it makes you more believable from the start.
Agreed. One of my favorite things to do is to bring a prop for my character. I wear glasses for McKenna, my current PC, because she was originally like a librarian, really super smart. She's a wizard. So I wear glasses to help me get into mind and character for her for a game. And that's always fun too, because then I can look across the table and push them up my nose when someone's being really ridiculous. That's always fun. But to your point as well, like when you're talking about personality and what their mannerisms are and things like that, but also come with flaws.
Oh, yeah.
You are not perfect. There is no perfect PC. Come with flaws, because that's also fun to explore. And why are you that way? What happened?
D&D 3rd edition or 3.5 had the supplemental rule system for flaws. And
that
drawbacks.
turned into a mechanic thing, and that's hard. I mean, actual flaws.
No, but I get what you're saying, and I do like the idea of when you're writing your character backstory, a couple of questions you should always ask yourself are, what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses?
Yes.
And if you can put those down, then you'll have a good idea of, here's what my character is good at. I mean, you can incorporate fears, things that have happened in their past that they might find traumatic. Like if you have a fear of fire, we've had characters play with that before.
Yes. So
whenever there was like a wall of fire or a fireball cast, they just flee the room and run away. So those kind of things make interesting character interactions. And I think flaws can be one of those that are more story based than strengths.
Yeah, I kind of like that idea. Like if you were like required to have a flaw, like I just never really thought of that. Honestly, every time I'm like, I built this character to be like, he's tough and ready to go. But like if I had a character that like, he's a compulsive liar.
Yeah.
And he can't stop himself. I'm like, that'd be just a really interesting way to play your story. Just like, he just never told the truth the entire time.
Yeah.
Until he managed to, control it at like the end, of course, because that's his life goal at this point.
You're playing Cyric or something.
Yes.
Compulsive liar.
Exactly.
One other point that I was going to bring up was how your character interacts with other classes or other races in the world. Having an understanding of if they have any, type of specific, racism or favoritism, or they've had bad experiences. Maybe they, didn't get along with orcs because they used to raid their farms or things like that. But incorporate ideas of how they view the rest of the world, so that when you have moments where they interact with other races and with other creatures, I'm not trying to say make something problematic in your game.
Right.
And I'm not speaking in favor of racism, of course, but sometimes people's flaws are that they don't give everybody the fair shake that they deserve.
Right.
And if you're playing a character that's like that, I think it's an important thing to have in your character backstory so the DM is prepared to deal with situations like that.
Yeah, it's like, that's what my character is. I'm a dwarf and I'm racist towards Rob.
Oh,
He's what, like
a winged elf.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, this is elf dude. I call him a drow all the time, and he's very offended by that.
As he should be.
I mean, from Tolkien, that is kind of the common fantasy racism is dwarves versus elves, or everyone versus humans.
Right. Well, and it's interesting when you're looking at like building out like a city or something like that, one of the things that's actually suggested is how many of a certain race live here and what's kind of the dynamic. And to be perfectly honest, I tend to kind of whitewash that in my mind because I'm like, oh, well, everybody just lives harmoniously. But when you actually consider, elves are actually by their very nature, even written in D&D, as being kind of seclusive.
Yeah.
And racist.
And racist.
Very
Exactly.
racist.
Very racist. So what does that actually mean for your campaign? And how does an elven PC relate to her peers in the group? That's actually something I'm kind of working through with my own campaign that I'm starting, or that I'm currently working on, is because elves have a little bit of a different backstory, but what does that mean for everybody else?
Right.
And what do they even know of the history of elves, and what do they perceive that as?
So and I think elves are an interesting example because they are always, frequently portrayed as very hoity-toity and consider themselves to be the superior race, a lot like, white males do in our world here, right? So they kind of take on that role. But it was interesting when they came out with like the advanced race builder book, and they broke everything down by how many racial points that they had spent to create the races, and elves were right there at the top. At which point our good friend Nate was always making the comment, they're not racist, they're just right.
They're
literally the best race.
How did I know that was what was coming up?
Well, I mean, it's one thing he always falls back to. No, look at the book. They have the most points. They've got the most
so
abilities.
They are the most superior. It's not racism if it's true.
I mean, they live longer.
Oh gosh, that's so untrue. But yeah, it's funny to laugh about.
This is fantasy, guys.
Exactly. It's fantasy. But that is one thing I think we do need to be sensitive to is the concept that in many cases, especially early on in D&D, a lot of these races were based on real world cultures. And so you do have to be cautious when you're portraying some of those cultures and when you're embracing some of those kind of old school D&D ideals of which classes are racist, or which races are racist and which ones don't like other ones. There is a possibility that you're offending someone in the real world. And that's definitely not something we want to do at our table.
No.
So I do think that as our culture has become more woke and more aware of these things, it is something that does require a little bit of introspection and further consideration. And I've even tried to more recently look at the kind of characters that I'm playing and the kind of things that I'm portraying and be more inclusive in the way that I play. I'm trying to play different types of things than I would normally play and see things from other people's point of view.
No, that's fair. Definitely want to be like trying not to offend anybody, but you still want to be accurate to like the world and its characters, because the world and characters are going to be racist or not racist because that's just how they were built in the story. So, but of course, you got to be careful about these things all the time.
There's probably another conversation for another time, but your session 0 and the communication that comes from that, and I recently stumbled upon like the checklist of it. Basically, it's a checklist to say, what am I okay with?
Yes. And
is it something that I want it behind a veil? Is it something that I don't want to see it at all? Is it something that that I'm okay with, like a fade to black when you're talking about sex and things like that? So you actually have this conversation in your session 0. If someone is saying, no, I don't want to really be a part of racism or something like that, that's okay. I can work with that. But at the same time, if you have a table that's like, no, absolutely, like, let's go, but it's that communication up front. What's everybody okay with? And obviously being flexible in that space.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Session 0 is incredibly important. And I think nowadays it's become way more important than it ever used to be.
Oh, yes.
These were things that we never thought about early on in our gaming career. All of us were friends. We all got along. We had pretty similar backgrounds and ideologies and things like that. So we didn't ever have to address this kind of stuff. A lot of times when there would be intimacy between two players, we'd just naturally kind of fade to black and say, okay, well, you wake up the next morning and you had a good time. right? Things like that. But I think you're right. Nowadays, it is really, really important to incorporate into a session 0, not just your character backstory, but what as a player, not as a character, is okay with you being part of your game. And there's a lot of races in D&D, like the Drow that you mentioned, that do have a built-in, history of slavery and female domination over the males of the society. And you have to address whether or not those things are acceptable in a game. If you want to stick to the canon as the way that the creatures were originally written, or do you not want to incorporate that and go with more of a modern 5th edition kind of ruling where that they don't have the slavery rules, they don't have that type of a interaction anymore. So very good points, Timothy.
I definitely got to think about all that, I guess, at this point, because just got to be careful, honestly. And there's people out there who will, like, some people are just like, thick skin. It's okay. I can accept whatever you throw at me.
Mm-hmm.
Other people are like, no, that's not okay at all. And I don't even want to be a part of the session. So, it's just more about having fun.
Yes,
exactly.
The DM's going to definitely, that's another thing the DM has to juggle around with. It's just like, let's just make sure the game is, everyone can enjoy it at the same time. Because some people are like, I want this to be as accurate as possible. I don't want any kind of like straying from what the canon is. And so it's a big hurdle, especially with your backstory, because backstory can really affect a lot of that.
Well, I think tying it to your backstory is a good thing to know too. And in fact, it might be a good thing to do a session 0, or at least ask those kind of questions before you get to writing your character backstory, because there's a possibility you might not want to include those kind of themes in your character backstory if somebody at the table is not going to be comfortable with them in the first place.
Multiple session 0s in some cases.
Right. Yeah. So you could have like a session 0 to talk about the do's and don'ts of this game, go write your character backstories, and then come back together and do like your official session 0 where the world is introduced and the characters are introduced, and you get that first opportunity to find your voice and interact with each other.
I like that.
Okay, let's move on to tricks of the trade. Okay, in today's tricks of the trade, we are just going to give one idea each, or maybe more if we keep coming up with some ideas of what might make for an interesting character backstory. So whoever would like to go first, just speak up whenever you've got a thought, and then the rest of us will chime in. It looks like Timothy has got an idea already ready to go. So
I was the one pointed at. Everybody always has the trope of my parents died, and that's why I started adventuring. Your parents are alive. They're happy and healthy, and everything's fine. You have a big brood of siblings. You have a big family. Start with why. Why did you start adventuring? What happened that made you leave this idyllic family to go and adventure? Have a interview with yourself of what are you trying to accomplish? And also it gives the GM as well as the players other people to interact with at the same time. So what if something happens to that family?
Having a lot of family members alive is a good opportunity for a DM to motivate a player.
Oh yeah.
Because so often we do play, islands in the stream, right? They're all by themselves in this world that's moving around them. And it can be hard for a DM to find a motivation that's going to make a player grab a plot hook. But it'd be really easy if one of your siblings disappeared or one of your parents had an urgent quest that they needed to do for you. Definitely having a bigger family and more connections to the world gives the DM a lot more opportunity to make your character do something they want you to do.
Exactly.
I think a good idea if like you're trying to like we were talking before, having a flaw, say like someone was in extreme debt. And he basically has to pay back this family or organization. So that's why he's adventuring, and he takes extreme risks to get as much money as possible to pay it back because he's obscene amount of money. Maybe because his family just dumped it on him and ran, or they passed away and he just got the debt. That's another way to really kind of get your character going. It's like, oh, this is just already, he's just held back by this, so he's just going hardcore to get all the funds he can.
I love that motivation.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. You could definitely motivate a player with that too, because
good money.
Good money can motivate them, and also loan sharks could motivate them.
Yes.
I think for me, one idea I had that I thought would be kind of interesting would be taking a character that had a pretty significant dump stat, but then having an ego that makes them believe that they are going to be good at whatever that dump stat is related to.
Quick question. What's a dump stat?
So a dump stat, good question. A dump stat is like you have like a really low roll, like an 8 or a 7. The stat that you throw it into that you're not planning on using is going to be your dump stat. So like say if you're a fighter, typically you're going to throw that into intelligence or wisdom. Your dump stat is not really related to the class you're playing, so it doesn't really matter if it's low. But I'm thinking more like you play a monk, you throw your dump stat into your dexterity or something, and then you go out still trying to act like you're as good as all these other monks. Yes, you have the class levels, you have all the things that come with it, but you're just really clumsy. And you still have this ego that tells you like, oh, no, guys, I can do this. I'm a monk. I got this. But you just continually make these, ego malfunctions that cause you to be clumsy and ridiculous.
I love that one.
That'd be super hard.
Mm-hmm.
But
I think sometimes the playing to your flaws in a really humorous way makes a really interesting game.
It would definitely
be way more funny.
It would definitely be a choice, because then, so going off based on your idea. So you have, let's say, a 7 dexterity.
Yeah.
So then you pump your strength and your con. And so now all of a sudden you just hit really hard.
Right.
But you are terrible on your feet.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrible. You can grapple someone like nobody's business. You are the best wrestler out there.
That would be pretty funny though. Like, and you're always like, oh, no. You know what? At the monastery, we learned how to climb walls. That's not a problem for him, right? But then when you get up on the ledge, you're like, no, I can make the balance check too, and you're just always falling and silly things like that. I don't know. I find it to be an interesting way of playing a character. Anything else before we go? Anybody other ideas? No, we're good. Okay, thank you for tuning in today. I appreciate both of you being here. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, leave it a review on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. Check out my book, Session Zero, the DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in Any System. You can find that on Amazon. There's also a link in the show notes. And if you have any ideas for future episodes or things that you would like us to talk about, or you just want to drop me a line and talk about something or collaborate with me, go ahead and send me an email. The address is all one word, dungeonsdragonpsychology@gmail.com. And we will see you later, my Psycholithids. Until next session.